From the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University, this is Trending Globally. I'm Dan Richards. Over the last few years, it seems like events that used to exist only in action and spy movies have become reality.
Federal authorities are investigating a major cyber attack targeting America's energy infrastructure.
Someone has hacked into Sony Pictures.
Investigating a North Korean link to this hacking attack.
Colonial Pipeline says it was hit by ransomware.
Experts believe Russia was behind the hack of a company called Solarium, sending malware to 18,000 private and government organizations, including the U.S. Departments of Justice, Treasury, State, and Homeland Security.
Top executives from multiple cybersecurity firms telling the Senate Intel Committee that similar cyber attacks are likely occurring in the U.S. right now.
You've seen it in headlines, and maybe you felt it in your own life. Cyber attacks have become more frequent and more damaging. So just how big a threat are cyber attacks? And how do we protect ourselves from them, as individuals and as a society? According to our two guests on this episode, to answer these questions, you actually need to ask some deeper questions about the role of technology in society and about the relationship between governments, businesses, and individuals more broadly. Congressman Jim Langevin represented Rhode Island in the House of Representatives from 2001 to 2023. Chris Inglis served as cyber director under the Biden administration until this past February. He also served as deputy director of the NSA from 2006 to 2014. Under the Biden administration, they were part of a group tasked with re-envisioning what America's cybersecurity strategy should be. As Chris Inglis described it,
the strategy is sometimes criticized as being perhaps too ambitious. I actually take that as a feature.
This spring, Jim Langevin is leading a study group at the Watson Institute on the issue of cybersecurity, and he recently brought Chris Inglis to campus to discuss the work they've done and what this new cybersecurity strategy might mean for all of us. On this episode, you'll hear from Chris and Jim about that strategy and about why so much of cybersecurity actually has very little to do with technology and a lot more to do with all of us. Jim Langevin and Chris Inglis, thank you so much for coming on to Trending Globally.
Thank you for having us, Dan.
Great to be here.
So I wonder if we could just start with a definition of cybersecurity. I think it's the type of thing a lot of people, know it when they see it, but does it have any particular sort of definition?
I think you've asked exactly the right question. Most people start with how do you do it, which you get lost all of a sudden in all sorts of techniques and technologies and protocols, but you've asked the what question, which I think is the right question. My simple definition of cybersecurity is having the confidence that the internet and all the things connected to it will meet your expectations, period. Pure and simple. Will it do what you want it to do? Do you have the confidence that when you reach for a light switch or you reach for your bank account or you try to do something using the internet as the means to do it, that it will do that? That's cybersecurity. There's a lot of detail in the how, but that question of what that you've asked motivates us to think of why we care about it. Why is it important to us?
Jim?
Couldn't agree more. The internet was developed as this free and open architecture, initially for communication, and it has evolved into something much broader that we all use now every day. It's an amazing tool that we've all come to rely on and appreciate. The challenge is, of course, that there are those who have found vulnerabilities in this free and open architecture and have used it for nefarious intent or to disrupt that ability to have the internet do what you expect it to do, as Director Inglis has outlined.
And speaking of those disruptions or those actors who are seeking to cause disruptions, what are the main types of risks we face when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, it runs the range from nation states or cyber criminal enterprises, rogue hackers. Some do it perhaps either for fun, but most often it's more likely for nefarious intent.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It is a continuum, and there's no lack of imagination on the part of those who would hold these capabilities at risk.
As Chris described it, there are really two layers to cybersecurity. The first,
at the foundation, there is data, there are computers, there are systems that connect us to that data and to those computers.
But the value of all that technology comes from, of course, what we use it for, which is the second layer.
Ultimately, all of that data, all of those systems are useful to do something more, to deliver critical functions, to deliver your ability to live the life that you want to live, whether it's to access your bank account, manage your personal affairs, manage a business that has to touch things in supply chains you'll never physically be able to reach. Those critical functions are something that live on top of that data and systems, and those are increasingly being held at risk by adversaries in this space.
Cybersecurity involves managing both of these layers, the technology itself and then the things we do with the tech. Those two layers are also kind of exemplified by the two different paths Chris and Jim took into the field of cybersecurity. Here's Chris.
I was a computer scientist in the mid-1980s looking to make good use of my skills. I was hired by the National Security Agency, and my first job was to help them build what we called secure computers in the day. Perfect computers. Computers that would do exactly what they were supposed to do and nothing that they weren't supposed to do. We realized over time that that was not possible for one thing above all others, which is once it came into contact with a human being, they being somewhat unpredictable and having some degree of initiative and discretion at their disposal. At best, you could make defensible computers. And as those computers became increasingly networked, what resulted in those days is this field, this idea that we needed to actually attend to what we described in the day as information security that ultimately became cybersecurity.
Jim came less from the cyber side of this than from the security side of the equation. He was sworn into Congress in January 2001, just as both national security and the internet were about to become defining features of our society.
You can imagine all of the horrors and the fears of what perhaps could come next after 9/11. We thought we'd be focusing on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats to the country, the real bad things that could happen.
But one day, in 2007, Jim realized we needed to be paying a lot more attention to a different type of threat.
My staff director, who came in one day with his hair on fire and said, "Boss, you've got to get this briefing in a SCIF."
SCIF stands for Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. They're places used for discussing highly sensitive information. Jim went to the briefing.
From these two scientists out at Idaho National Labs who had found a remote way of attacking a turbine. We began by watching the video of this basically used turbine they had purchased, and the generator is operating normally, and then all of a sudden you see the generator start to spin up out of control, and it starts to smoke and shake, and basically it shook itself apart. These two scientists came up with a way through it's called a SCADA system. It stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition System, that allows for the management of things like pumps and valves. That these systems have brought great efficiencies to managing our electric grid, or the flow of petroleum, or water and sewage treatment systems. Remote management has brought great efficiencies, but with it has also created avenues for nefarious things to happen, bad actors taking advantage of those remote systems. And that's exactly what they demonstrated. And that was what was the alarm bell to me that said, we need to look into this further. If you could do it there on one turbine, you could do it at scale potentially. If a bad actor were to do that in the dead of winter, you can imagine not only would it do great damage to our economy, but could easily lead to loss of life as well.
Jim and his team started to look more closely into the security of the networks and computers that run America's critical infrastructure. What they found was not heartening.
We spoke to the owners and operators, of course, of the electric grid. Many of them said, yes, it could happen, but we are prepared. But it became pretty evident as you did more and more research, peeling back the layers of an onion, that they weren't prepared, and more work needed to be done. And so that began my journey in cyber, and I guess I've never looked back. Along the way, of course, I met Deputy Director of NSA, Director Inglis.
Jim and Chris, in one way or another, have been working together ever since to increase our country's investment in cybersecurity. And more than just investment, they're trying to promote a more holistic way of thinking about cybersecurity. And what does that more holistic view of cybersecurity look like? One analogy for thinking about better cybersecurity actually comes from another piece of technology we all use and rely on: cars and automobile safety. You see, there isn't just one company, safety feature, or government law that makes driving cars safe. And if you stop to think about it, the amount of people, organizations, and businesses all working together and in different ways to make the act of driving reliable, useful, and safe, it's kind of mind-boggling.
If you're going to buy a car, someone has attended to what its safety features are. Somebody's actually built a road system and sustains that road system. Somebody polices that road system to make sure that we kind of roll up folks who are driving drunk, and so on and so forth. We actually have very kind of sophisticated systems to understand, do I have an expectation of what my role is and what other parties' role is in those other systems? We need to do the same thing in cyberspace. It's that system of systems that contains technologies, but has a very significant kind of time and attention given to who's accountable for what.
As Chris and Jim became more and more involved in the issue of national cybersecurity, crisis after crisis increasingly put cybersecurity and the roles of different groups involved in it into the national spotlight. The Sony picture hack, the SolarWinds attack, the Colonial Pipeline attack, the list goes on and on. As Chris sees it, the biggest turning point might have come in 2017.
In 2017, there was a series of attacks by nation states. In one case, it was the North Korean nation state did something called the WannaCry attack. Microsoft put out the code fix to say, if you simply do this update, you'll be fine. But many organizations hadn't done it. North Koreans attacked that, brought down the entire national health system of the United Kingdom. Later that same year, the Russian government brought down the entirety of the Maersk shipping line worldwide, brought down a sizable component of FedEx's European operations. And you can only imagine how many people and organizations depend upon the logistics both of them bring to bear. All of a sudden, this thing that used to be isolated to an attack here, an attack there, you kind of thanked your lucky stars that you weren't under that particular lightning bolt, became indiscriminate and impactful across a very broad area. I think that's when it really came kind of to us that this is something that is not a similar problem one to another. It's the same problem. And we all suffer the same problem.
These attacks and the realizations they led to, along with advocacy from people like Jim and Chris, led to the creation in 2019 of something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission.
The Solarium Commission was created in the National Defense Authorization Act, and we were charged with developing an overarching strategy to better protect the United States against cyber attacks of significant consequence, that we needed a master plan to how best to protect the country in cyberspace. It was nonpartisan, bipartisan. We just rolled our sleeves, had great, robust, in-depth discussions on various aspects of what stronger cybersecurity looks like.
In other words,
how do we think about this? What should we do about this? And how do we actually deploy all of our resources? How do we have a whole-of-a-nation approach to get our arms around this?
The Solarium Commission made a number of proposals, one of which was to create a new role in government, the National Cyber Director. The first person to fill that role?
I can remember kind of, along with Congressman Langevin and others, strongly recommending that we have something called the U.S. National Cyber Director. So we helped form that ball, and then using a sports metaphor to hurl that ball into the air. I had no idea I was going to catch it. Right.
Well, and I wanted to ask about that because, you began serving in that position in July 2021. How did you think of that position when you took it on? Obviously, it hadn't existed before.
The U.S. National Cyber Director wasn't intended to create a vertical, somebody with a megaphone that would tell everybody what to do, but rather to form the horizontal. How do we form a coalition of the willing going forward? And so the job essentially entailed doing four things. One, how do we create greater coherence and collaboration across the federal government? Turns out that in the day, we've discovered that most people in the private sector, when they looked at the government, the U.S. government in particular, and said, who's doing cyber, you needed a PhD to figure it out. Second, how do we actually engender, kind of facilitate private-public collaboration? Third responsibility the National Cyber Director had was to take a look to the future, not just the present. Fourth responsibility is kind of an inside the government play, but how do we account for the dollars and the resources that are being expended by the federal government so that between the executive branch and the legislative branch that there's a good relationship. So the U.S. National Cyber Director came into being as something that was nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate, and therefore was a compact, an agreement between those two branches to serve the interest of the public to create coherence.
As National Cyber Director, Chris led the creation of a new national cyber strategy for the United States, which under the Biden administration was released in March of this year.
The strategy is sometimes criticized as being perhaps too ambitious. I actually take that as a feature.
This strategy touches on just about every aspect of American society. It has recommendations for government, for private companies, for how the two should work together, for how individuals need to change their behavior. Chris said he wanted to make sure the strategy passed what he calls the, quote, museum test.
Ever been to a museum and there are people standing in the far left and the far right corners of the room and they look at a portrait and they both say, it's looking at me. That, I think, is what we tried to create in the National Cybersecurity Strategy.
This strategy has lots of components, but as Chris and Jim put it,
The National Cyber Strategy proposes two fundamental shifts in how the United States allocates roles, responsibilities, and resources in cyberspace.
The first major shift,
rebalancing the responsibility to mitigate risks away from end users and towards those entities most capable of accepting and addressing those risks.
in other words, expecting everyone to have optimal passwords, to ardently follow their device's security features. I mean, we should all do this, but let's face it, it hasn't really worked yet. And as they say, hope is not a strategy. The second major shift
is to realign incentives in favor of long-term investments that make cyberspace more resilient and defensible.
So not just getting good at reacting to crises, but reducing the number of crises that occur. As Chris put it,
we're actually pretty good, given our experience over the last 30, 40 years, at responding to crises. There was something about a year and a half ago, the Log4j crisis.
This was a cybersecurity breach that was relatively quickly resolved.
And we did a really good job, which then misleads us to think that we can do that again and again and again. But if we did that perfectly every time, we just lose more slowly. How do we make it such that we build our software, we build our systems, we raise our children so that they're inherently resilient and robust against the threats that naturally occur in this space? That requires us to double down on how do we go all the way back to the beginning of what are the role assignments. When you buy a car, there's an air safety bag, there's a seatbelt in it. When you buy a pound of the cloud, I know for your audience we don't buy it that way, but when you buy a pound of a cloud, there isn't today something that is atomically bound to it that would be the moral equivalent of an air safety bag or a seatbelt. We need to do that. And when it's all said and done, I think that we have, touch wood, passed that museum test, where there are any number of parties that would look at this and say, that's my strategy. I'm in it, right? I have a role to play in it.
Now, having a good strategy is essential, but of course, that's just the beginning. So what comes next?
It's always the devil in the details, and so what lies ahead is actually moving off on the implementation of this.
I had assumed that Chris and Jim would say that for implementation of this strategy to work, we all need to put much, much more focus, both publicly and privately, on cybersecurity. But that's not really how they framed it.
I would say to get cyber right, we shouldn't elevate it in its priority. We should subordinate it.
Here's what he means by that.
So this won't be about cyber for its own sake, any more than bigger brakes on a fast car is about the brakes. It's about the fast car. I want to focus on the aspirations we have for the use of the internet, cyberspace.
How do you envision working with, these massive tech companies, which at this point are as big and influential as any auto company in terms of making sure that they are following rules, even if it might inhibit their growth somewhat? Is there tension there, or do you get a sense there's an opening for more sort of cooperation?
I do see that there's an increasing desire for collaboration in this space. There is a certain degree of self-enlightenment kind of taking place at the moment. There are a number of companies that of their own volition are saying, I'm going to actually vouchsafe for the resilience and robustness of the products that I produce under all foreseeable conditions. Market forces then take over at that point. You remember when Volvo started crashing cars into walls 20 years ago? People are like, what's that all about? That's market forces beginning to stand into kind of automobile safety. And they sold more than a few cars based upon they had a better product in terms of the safety features associated with that. But at that point, there will be the need to say, but there's a further distance we need to go, that we cannot leave this to market forces alone. And we'll have to stand in using our regulatory authorities. But that has to be done not as a blunt force tool, but using kind of the degree of consultation with the affected industry so that we understand what the real points of influence are. Let's not regulate the wrong things and impose costs that have no benefit. So if we get that right, we can then achieve the degree of harmony that we today have in, again, you mentioned it, automobiles which don't exist alone.
The way the ecosystem works right now is that there's this incentive to be first to market versus secure to market. And so we want to change that dynamic. And the question is, how do we do it? Some will happen on its own, good intentions, of course. Others may require more regulation, or you can use market forces. For example, the government is a huge purchaser of software and hardware, and using that purchasing power to require certain things in software so that it is more secure, which will have positive effects, spillover effects in the private sector. I often have used the analogy that we have the safest airline industry in the world. Certainly, both because of the good intentions of the airlines, they want to get their passengers safely from point A to point B. But those good intentions get us, about 80 or 90% of the way down the field. The rest of it, we are lucky that we have the FAA and the NTSB or the Congress that has, required certain things be done to ensure that we have the safest airline industry in the world. That's what we want to do with cybersecurity.
What worries you both most about the future of cybersecurity?
The thing that keeps me awake at night is not the answer that's expected, which might be some rogue nation state or some criminal gang that's hiding in some sanctuary. It's our own complacency. It's what I describe sometimes as proactive ambivalence. We all know that there's a problem. We can smell the smoke, occasionally see kind of a sliver of fire, and we assume somebody else is going to fix it. We're hoping that there's some group of champions, maybe people who have the word IT or cyber in their job title, that they'll fix it for us. That is not going to happen, right? Those role assignments haven't been made, and each of us has to play a part in the defense, in the creation of resilience and the defense of that resilience in this world. In the same way that when I came to Brown University today, I drove a car and I parked the car. I locked it. I didn't leave an iPad on the dash. I looked around to make sure when I crossed the street between the parking garage and the terminal that there wasn't a car coming, so on and so forth. I actually participated in my own defense in a world where I had every expectation that somebody had actually kind of engineered the roadways and the parking garage and the airport so that it was easily navigable, right? That somebody was taking care of the things that only they can do. We need the equivalent to that in cyberspace. Individuals have roles, organizations have roles, governments have roles. Once we get them largely defined, we'll sort it out as we go forward.
Yeah, and I think Chris hit on something really, really important, that the one thing that still is sort of left undone, with a lot of work to do, is instilling that sense of responsibility that we all have to be good stewards of our own safety and safe operation of the internet and use of the internet in cyberspace. So practicing good cyber hygiene is essential. If everyone had used strong passwords and two-factor authentication, make sure that you're operating the most up-to-date software, you're applying your security patches, not clicking on malicious links, all the basics, we'd go a long way toward having a much more secure experience and much more secure cyber ecosystem. I've often said that we still need a Smokey the Bear campaign for cyber, that only you can prevent forest fires, only you can prevent cyber attacks or cyber intrusions. It would go a long way if we can elevate that national conversation, starting hopefully in our system of education is a great place to start. I know there are some things that are going on already in that space, but we need more.
And we have some great role models in the world,
including one role model for whom the stakes of good cybersecurity could not be higher.
But I would give a particularly kind of sharp shout out to the Ukrainians for all the reasons your audience might appreciate. And one thing more, which is I think they've done a masterful job at defending their cyber infrastructure. And it's not because they have the best technology in the world. It clearly is a moment in time when there are kind of ragged edges under physical and kind of cyber assault by the Russian onslaught. And yet they have built on top of that a degree of expertise on the part of their people, the professionals who do information technology and cyber work, but their people as well, such that the Russians have been vexed beyond all measure, trying to hold them at risk.
Another thing the Ukrainian government has done has been to keep their eye on what all of this cybersecurity is for.
And
to go back to Chris's metaphor about why you put big brakes
US dollar
on a
compensation
car,
fund was
They've
established,
never lost sight of the end
which
game.
paid
I
surviving
was talking
forced
with
slave
a,
laborers, and the
Deputy
highest
Prime
payout
Minister
was
of the Ukrainian government not
about
long ago.
$10,000.
And he talked through all the things that they're doing that I've just briefly described. And he said, but one thing,
but there was a clause
he said, we
in
have to
that,
make sure that we continue to deliver the new innovative digital service to our citizens.
Said that German business as a whole does not have to admit any kind of
being
crime,
able to file their
wrongdoing,
taxes
or
online,
culpability,
being able to have digital identities that are easy and,
crimes of the Third Reich.
Efficient to use
so they paid money
across the economy.
But
and I
there was
just
a difference between
that in the face of this
paying
onslaught,
money and taking responsibility.
This is like every time a bank gets fined, right? It's exactly the same. We fine you $600 billion, but you didn't do anything wrong, which begs the question, why am I fining you $600 billion?
Right. About the use of digital infrastructure.
And
that's a great example for us to follow.
German business,
and to build
by
on
and
what Chris
large,
said just 2 weeks ago,
there are some positive
General
counterexamples.
Nakasone here, who was the
To
director of
pretend
NSA and
like
who had
nothing
it as,
happened, and
the four-star general
continue
in
to
charge
kind of
of US Cyber
whitewash history
Command.
today,
And he
which is also the
described
impetus
a
why I wrote
partnership
this
with the
book,
Ukrainians
to kind
and
of
how
shine
we
a
have
light
been
on
defending
this brazen
forward,
whitewashing that's
defending
going on today,
and
where you
helping them
have,
to
for example,
identify
the BMW
vulnerabilities
Foundation
in their own
Herbert
systems,
Quandt with the
which,
motto
we
"Inspire
have those lessons
responsible
learned for us
leadership,"
as well.
in an infant man who saved BMW from bankruptcy in 1960,
more prepared to
but
deal
also
with the Russians.
you
and
know,
I'm convinced
built
it's
a
major reason why the
concentration
Russians
camp
have
in
not
German-occupied
been as
Poland.
successful as we thought they would be.
You know,
through the use of
oversaw
cyber attacks,
the exploitation of
against
thousands of forced
Ukrainians
slave
for
laborers in
any
battery
blowback,
factories in
that we might
Berlin
have
and
experienced
acquired
here
companies started
in the
from
United States.
France. And after
Incredible
having prepared
example,
to have reckoned with these crimes by
heartening
saying,
in
oh
the
yeah, we've
sense,
commissioned
too,
a
of
study,
it's not
1,200 pages in academic
exclusively about
German,
how much
it's all in here,
money you
but then
have
because
or
these
how
studies
much
are only discussed in
technical
academic circles and
expertise
never
you have,
reach a wider
it's
audience,
sort of also
they
about
basically
just
hide
the
it in plain
bigger
sight.
societal
they let it
commitment.
collect dust.
Technology
In
matters.
fact, it's become quite a
Expertise
sort of
matters more
MO,
in
right? What
coalitions
happens
and
is if you get
collaborations
Rumble,
matter
you find
more.
3 underemployed German historians, you hand over the family archives, who knows if it's the whole thing, and then you write something which is kind of critical but somewhat exculpatory. It's published in German and nobody ever reads it because they've all forgotten about the scandal 7 years later.
Thank you so much for talking to us and Training Globally.
Thank you.
The studies are good. They're very thorough. So, I mean, I think it's not... There are a few exceptions. I mean, there was a
This episode of Training Globally was produced by me, Dan Richards, with production assistance from Sam McKeever-Holtzman. Our theme music is by Henry Bloomfield. Additional music by the Blue Dot Sessions.
But
if you want to learn more about the Biden administration's national cyber strategy, we'll put links to it in the show notes. And if you like Trending Globally, please subscribe and give us a review and rating wherever you listen to podcasts.
While
better yet, tell a friend about the show. If you have any questions, comments, or ideas for guests or topics, send us an email at trendingglobally@brown.edu. Again, that's all one word, trendingglobally@brown.edu.
The brand has to be
We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Trending Globally.
Doesn't care that Papa was a Nazi war criminal. He was a successful businessman. That's what matters. Of course, their entire identity is wrapped up as heirs. Of course, stand in the shadow of their fathers and grandfathers because they didn't.